I discovered at the age of 15 that my brother's schooling was more valuable than my life. It was a chilly early spring evening. I recall how the air smelled of leftover pasta and how the light flickered above the kitchen table. As if she were going to lead a prayer, my mother sat across from me with her hands folded nicely on the table. My father stood behind her, his face expressionless and his arms folded. That was when my world would fall apart, even though I was unaware of it at the time. Our insurance provider had just hung up the phone. I was well aware that the necessary treatment was not covered. It was too uncommon, too costly, and too fresh. However, I was also aware of their savings, or at least I believed I was. A fund for unexpected expenses, a fund for college, something. Silently, I said, "So what now?" My mother didn't recoil. "After discussing it, your father and I have decided not to proceed with the treatment, sweetheart." I blinked. "What are you saying?" "We've prayed about it," she added in a terribly composed tone. "We believe that God will provide a way if it is meant to be." I looked at her, wondering whether I had misinterpreted. Perhaps she was indicating that they were simply awaiting additional details or that we were seeking a second opinion. But everything became evident when my dad talked. "We just cannot afford to spend all of our money. This fall, Caleb begins his university studies. Caleb has arranged everything, including his housing and tuition. You cannot throw that away." "What should I throw away?" The floor seemed to vanish beneath me. "You're picking college over me?" I inquired. I didn't even sound like myself when I spoke. My mother was upset, as if I had just made a terrible accusation against her. "Don't say it that way. Honey, it's not a choice. We simply have faith in God's plan. We think everything will turn out the way it should." Thereafter, I'm not sure how long I sat there. I refrained from crying. I refrained from screaming. I didn't even dispute it. I simply got to my feet, went to my room, shut the door, and never left. They didn't knock. They didn't inquire about my health. They simply went to sleep as if nothing had happened. I came to a realization that night that was so deep it almost broke me. I would have to save myself if I wanted to survive. I didn't get any sleep. I spent the night investigating every desperate thought that occurred to me. For medical neglect, may a youngster disown their parents? Would I be able to get medical care if I were in juvenile detention? Could they release me without their consent? For a terrifying moment, I even entertained the idea of arresting myself, if only temporarily, to secure custody and potentially receive treatment, but I was aware that there was little chance. Time was running out, and I was losing support from people. Perhaps, though, there was still one person. Like a match sparked in the dark, a name suddenly came to me. Ruth. Ruth is the eldest sister of my mother. They never complimented her. She was always described as a mess or too emotional, lived in a dilapidated flat, and spent her money on takeout and stray kittens. However, my memory of her was different. Despite how seldom her visits were, she always took time to speak with me, talk a lot, as if I were worth the wait. I didn't call her, though. I didn't call her just yet. I wasn't prepared to seek assistance. All I had to do was make it through the night. I thus prepared a suitcase with my phone charger, some clothing, and a toothbrush. I took the $73 I had hidden in my closet in an old pencil box. I snuck out the back once the house was silent, and I heard their bedroom door click softly. There were no words, no farewell. I had no idea where I was heading. I simply knew that I would not return. That night, I spent hours walking. The streets were largely empty, except for the rare car, the bustle of late-night buses, and the flashing neon signs of shuttered stores. I refrained from crying. I didn't feel like crying just yet. I believe I was too numb to have any emotions. I simply kept going until I came to a peaceful small seat near a 24-hour supermarket. Although the seat was chilly and made of metal compared to where I had come from, it felt like the safest place on earth. I spent a lot of time sitting there. It was just me, my backpack, and a faintly buzzing streetlight overhead. No one paid attention to me as they went by, even people with coffee, dogs, and phones. I received no attention at all. Before dawn, I was just another kid sitting by himself on a bench wearing a sweatshirt. And then it dawned on me how I had always been unseen. Not right now. I am not on this bench alone. My entire existence is at stake. I discovered how to vanish without going home. I didn't argue or bang doors. I didn't act out or violate any regulations. My grades remained high. I avoided getting into trouble. When my mom was exhausted, I prepared dinner. When Caleb forgot, I took his dog for a walk. I was invisible even if I did everything right. Everything halted when Caleb became ill. There were specialists, appointments, and doctors involved. My parents sacrificed everything. My mother advised me to try some tea and get more rest when I became ill. Caleb's fare for science? There will be cake and balloons. What's my reward for writing? A shoulder touch and will you assist in setting the table? It didn't matter, I used to tell myself. That they were simply preoccupied. That perhaps it would be my turn. I thought people would notice me if I was good enough, patient enough, and quiet enough. That they would eventually come around and declare, "You matter too." However, I lost faith after they told me, face to face, that my life wasn't worth saving that evening at the kitchen table. Their daughter wasn't me, I was an inconvenience, a barrier. The line item in their budget is truly a barrier, and I was no longer able to pretend. I took my phone out of my pocket as the sky started to lighten, turning gentle tones of blue and gray. My fingers lingered on one touch. Ruth. She wasn't flawless. She didn't have a large home, a high-profile job, or any emergency, retirement, or college savings accounts. She was warm, though, something my parents were never. Although I didn't recall much about her visits, I did recall her chuckle and the way she treated me as though I wasn't a bother. I paused. What would happen if she didn't answer? What if she was unable to assist? What if I was simply exchanging one setback for another? However, a silent but obstinate voice inside of me urged, try. So I did. Once, then twice, the phone rang. Then she spoke. Hey? I went cold. Finding the right words took all of my strength. It's me, Ruth. Elena. She didn't inquire about the issue. She sounded unsurprised. I had erected a fortress around my heart, but she only whispered two words that broke it. Where are you? I informed her. She didn't inquire as to why. She made no hesitation. She just said, remain there. Her ancient red automobile arrived at the curb 10 minutes later. The front bumper was slightly crooked, would not fully fold up. Furthermore, it was the most exquisite object I had ever laid eyes on. Clad in a heavy cardigan and sporting mismatched shoes, she appeared to have hurried out the door. She looked at every inch of me. Not critical, just a little worried. She then spread her arms wide. I didn't anticipate crying. However, I did. The weight I had been carrying began to shift as soon as I entered her embrace. It didn't go away just yet, but it did shift. Because for the first time in days, someone had come for me. No inquiries. No restrictions. Let's get you warm is all. On the drive back to her flat, we didn't talk much. She refrained from pressing. She avoided using insignificant comments to initiate conversation. She didn't even need to touch me. She just drove with one hand on the wheel and the other lying on the seat between us. She gave me pajamas, gestured to her bed, and whispered, sleep. As we arrived at her apartment, a little, somewhat disorganized space above a bakery. We will discuss there in the morning. I refrained from arguing. For the first time since receiving the news, I allowed myself to think that perhaps, just possibly, I would be all right as I nodded and cuddled up behind her fading quilt. The aroma of coffee boiling and eggs cooking greeted me as I awoke. I briefly forgot my whereabouts. The bed was comfortable, soft, and worn. A plant was leaning toward the light in the small window next to me. On the nightstand, a book was open, its spine cracked as if it had been read too many times to count. Then I recalled. The kitchen. Received a phone call. E-call. Ruth. I gently sat up, feeling the agony in my chest that had been there for too many nights of being unwelcome. But it wasn't physical. Still in the jammies Ruth had given me the previous evening, I followed the noises into the kitchen. As if it were any other morning, she was singing sweetly to herself at the stove. She said, hey, without looking back, do you prefer scrambled eggs? I nodded since I didn't yet trust my voice. She placed a dish in front of me a few minutes later. Eggs, toast, a banana. It wasn't an elaborate lunch, but it was the first I hadn't felt like a burden to anyone in days. She sat across from me and poured me a cup of coffee. No inquiries. Not just being present is enough. Being there. I ate without talking. I became aware that I was starving halfway through. When I eventually put down my fork, Ruth put both hands over her cup and gave me a soft glance. Are you prepared to speak? Slowly, I nodded. Then it all poured out. I informed her of the doctor's visit, the diagnosis. I decided not to pursue treatment for me to tave me after a quiet discussion at the kitchen table. I informed her about their funds, Caleb's tuition, and my mother's statement that we're trusting God's plan. Ruth didn't say anything. Her face remained unchanged. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped her cup tightly, up tightly. She closed her eyes for a long time when I informed her that I would Google whether or not I would receive better medical treatment in jail. There was silence when I was done. Not uncomfortable, not hefty. Simply be silent. Then she spoke, clearly but softly. You won't return there. It wasn't a recommendation. There was no question. It was a choice. Additionally, it was the first time in my life that I had ever heard an adult say something that truly made me say yes. It's not a maybe. The offer is unconditional. Yes, exactly. You remain. I gave him, your place isn't that big. That big. I also don't want to ruin your life. She gazed at me as though I had outgrown myself. She replied, your parents no longer deserve that title the moment they abandoned you. You haven't destroyed my life. You are giving it a greater sense of purpose than it has had in a long time. I refrained from crying, but I let go of something and it was like a knot I didn't realize could loosen after being clenched for so long. Ruth picked up her phone and began making calls that afternoon. She took notes on a pad and asked clinic after clinic if they accepted payment plans and if they had someone who could see me soon as I sat on the couch with a mug of tea. The pricing didn't make her cringe. When they quoted thousands, she didn't think twice. She simply said, all right, thanks. I'll work it out. She retrieved a manila folder containing documents, money, and retirement documentation from the bottom of her drawer later that night. She began organizing after laying everything out on the dining table. I made an effort to stop her. I muttered, Ruth, you don't have to do this. I'm not She interrupted me. You're mine, she declared bluntly. You are mine, whether they realize it or not. I lay in her bed that night, surrounded by silence, and gazed up at the silence was of opposite. This is the type of silence that clings to you like a promise, as opposed to the type that leaves you feeling isolated. Are you feeling isolated? I had gone from worrying about whether I would make it through the week to having someone who would pay to keep me alive. I began to think that I might have a future for the first time in a very long time, and that perhaps, just possibly, I was worth saving. The days that followed went by slowly, quietly, and steadily, much like fog. Ruth made me breakfast every morning. She sat at the small dining table every afternoon and calmly flipped through bank records, medical pamphlets, and phone numbers, which only made me realize how much I had been living in fear. She was marketing her condo on the internet one evening as I came out of the shower. I gazed at the display. Are you selling your house? My voice broke. She raised her head. Elena, it's just walls. It's your walls. You've been residing there. The establishment is characterized by its unique collection of small mugs, its humming refrigerator, and its creaking floor. Taking floor. That made her smile. I detest that refrigerator. I didn't return the smile. Ruth, it's not necessary for you to do this. Please. This level of detail is excessive. She gently got to her feet, walked around the table, and sat next to me. You believe that I'm doing this out of necessity? She murmured as she brushed my wet hair away from my forehead. Elena, you deserve to live, which is why I'm doing this. Forever. I had never sobbed in front of her before. I sobbed. She also took her time with me. She didn't give me a slap on the back or give me tissues. As if she saw that some things had to come apart before they could be put back together, she simply allowed me to crack open softly. Thanks to a favor from an old colleague, Ruth was able to get an appointment with a specialist by the end of that week, who agreed to see me at a much reduced charge. Ruth accepted the price reduction without hesitation. She informed me she would use the bus after selling her car, the small red one with the window that wouldn't roll up. I'm able to move around, she declared, and I understand how to use them. Without hesitation, She completely upended every aspect of her existence. I knew Mom was giving up everything she owned for me, even if she never stated it aloud. Even yet, she never made any requests in return, not to exact revenge. However, the truth is what matters. Silence is necessary for certain people to survive, and others, we reconstruct with it. There were no grandiose cinematic scenes of recovery. Grand montages and triumphal music were absent. The days were simply peaceful, characterized by routines and gentle prodding. My growth was never a huge issue to Ruth. She took note of the little things, like the day I walked to the corner store and back without being sick, or the day I managed to eat without feeling queasy. She never wept or clapped. She simply remarked, "See?" while nodding, "Take a look at yourself," and that meant more in some way. However, another thing started to develop within me. I began to develop an alternative form of strength that is neither medical nor physical. Clarity was the key. A layer of the misinformation, partiality, and the way they referred to it as God's will when it was actually a decision came off each day as I recovered. My brother's tuition was worth more than my life, my parents decided, and I would always remember that information. However, I wouldn't be ashamed to wear it. I would purposefully carry it. I asked Ruth something I hadn't yet dared to utter aloud while I was cuddled up on her couch one rainy afternoon with a blanket over my legs and tea cooling. I am not here to exact revenge. Do you suppose see, however, the truth is what matters? Is what matters. Are Mimey disappearances? She took a while to respond. That was Ruth. She was never one to fill a void simply because it was silent. At last, she remarked, "I think they wonder if they got away with it." Between us, those words hung thick in the air. Not if I was all right. If I were alive, no. However, they might get away with it. The frigid fire became steady, under control, and unstoppable within me at that point. I didn't wish to cause them harm. It was not my intention to ruin their lives. All I wanted was for them to discover. Their Ruth was presented to them in Theatuation, that compelled them to take responsibility for their actions, forced them to acknowledge their actions. Since I hadn't vanished, I hadn't disappeared. I remained here, alive, restoring, observing, and they were mistaken if they believed the taken precedence would vanish like mine did. Caleb's future had been prioritized over my life. However, I had made it through, and now I had something they didn't expect. Another R. I had the steadfast backing of someone who had picked me. A secure location. I had the steadfast backing of someone who had picked me. So I began to think intentionally, not out of anger. What does receiving notice mean? What if those who attempted to remove me realized they were unsuccessful? I was afraid to shout. He would rather not stage major confrontation or publish about it online. I desired something straightforward, lasting, unquestionable. The one person they would never want to let down was the one I already knew to give it to. Not yet, though. I had to get stronger first. To begin with, I had to become the version of myself that they didn't think was possible. And little by little, I was making progress. My voice returned along with my strength. It returned in subtle ways, such as the way I started responding to emails for Ruth's tutoring clients, the way I discovered myself making lists once more, and the way I stood up straighter when I spoke to doctors. Plans, dreams. I felt older even though I was only 16, as if the world had finally poured in and cracked open. I felt older even though I was only 16, as if the world had finally poured in and cracked open. I felt older even though I was only 16, as if the world had finally poured in and cracked open. Ruth slid an envelope across the table and handed me a warm mug of coffee one morning. She whispered, "Your discharge paperwork. Your treatment is officially over." As I opened it, my hands shook a little. I had succeeded. No, thanks to them. The days that followed were quiet and introspective. I looked out Ruth's small kitchen window a lot, taking in the changing colors of the leaves and the world. They held the belief that I was too quiet, too young, and too appreciative to defend myself. That's when I felt the click in my brain. I realized instantly that I couldn't ignore it. They believed I had been erased, believed that I was too quiet, too young, and too appreciative to defend myself. They believed that I would remain absent and forgotten, a memory they could hide behind excuses. However, I remained here. I was alive. I also had evidence. Everything we required was in the folder Ruth kept hidden next to her file drawer. My diagnosis, the letter of treatment rejection sent straight to my parents, and the breakdown of costs that demonstrated they could have paid for it. We're heartbroken, but we can't drain Caleb's fund over a maybe, my mother wrote in a brief email to a family friend. That was the hardest part. She'll succeed if God wants her to. That line kept coming to mind. A maybe. I wasn't a maybe. I was a kid, their kid. More significantly, though, I could now hold them responsible. I am not here to exact revenge. However, the truth is what matters. Additionally, I knew just where to send it. Dr. Malcolm Avery, the prominent creator of the prestigious admissions consulting firm they had centered their entire careers on, was the one guy they revered the most. Ruth had told me stories about how they looked up to him for approval, and how he was the unseen kingmaker who made them successful. I had only ever met him once, at the age of 11. I had to be spoken to before I could speak. I had nothing to say now, though. I opened a blank email that afternoon while Ruth was neither he raw emotion nor all the pain was present. Blell. I also wrote my narrative. Nor the raw emotion, nor all that matters are the facts. Just the facts. Who I was. What they had done, the choice they chose to remain silent. They opted for. I've included documentation.emails, letters.medical documentation. I used one short sentence to wrap up the message. I believed you ought to be aware of the types of people you have surrounded yourself with. My fingers were hovering above the send button when I paused. The gesture has nothing to do with punishment. It was about taking back my role in the narrative. Someone had misused my name. I'm quiet, my life. My voice was coming now. Finally, with a deep breath, I hit the submit button. I didn't anticipate a reply. I didn't require one. Because the truth had now been revealed to someone who mattered to them, and they would never be able to stop the reverberation of that reality. Dr. Avery never responded to me. However, their empire started to fall apart 3 weeks after I sent that email. It is the company's website once prominently displayed the renowned Avery seal of endorsement, but now a faulty image link replaces it. Modestly. The company's website once prominently displayed the renowned Avery seal of endorsement, but now a faulty image link replaces it. I looked through the public directory of the consortium. They had lost their names. Simply gone. No justification. All that is left is silence. Nothing but quiet. That was precisely the kind of reaction a person like Dr. Avery would have when he became aware of his affiliation with deception. The actual fallout followed. Their once active social media accounts become quiet. One school removed them from a scheduled panel. Real ambiguous remarks on unethical practices and mishandled payments arose. They were removed from a planned panel by one school. Their other school secretly terminated their contract, refrained from boasting. I posted nothing whatsoever. I merely observed, and I was busy building while they grew more silent. By the time I was 18, I had used the lessons Ruth had taught me patience, forethought, and compassion to grow my side employment as a tutor into a modest company. 3 clients, young people like myself, from dysfunctional households with lofty goals and no one to support them in sharing their stories, were the beginning of it. I helped them write essays, apply, and stay strong in the face of the world's attempts to diminish them. They were honest. Colleges paid attention. Word got out. More customers arrived. I created a web page. Ruth took over as my full-time operations manager, handling email management, scheduling, and organization. I had never seen someone do it as well as she did. I could tell she was proud even though she didn't express it. As a result, I gave her something that no one had before. I gave her the keys on her birthday. I am heading to a cottage in the sun by a peaceful lake. She lived in a home equipped with a leak-proof kitchen and a reading porch. She shed tears, the silent type that result from years of being ignored. Then I gave her an airline ticket to Greece, surprising her once more. She once had a photograph of Santorini pasted on her desk. She was leaving now. Her trip-related post stated, "Thank you for giving me a life I never thought I could have, Elena, my niece." I had no idea what that post would accomplish, but I found out in a matter of days. since it got to them. My folks. I'm not sure how they saw it. Perhaps someone forwarded it, or they still looked up my name in resentful moments. Abruptly, the stillness broke. They began to make contact. Emails first. Courteous. Empty. We're pleased with the work you've done. Reconnecting would be wonderful. Next came the texts. Next came the phone calls. I updated my phone number. They weren't finished, though. They were waiting outside the exit, appearing smaller than I remembered. When I went outside one day after speaking at a conference on student mentoring, the fit of my dad's outfit was off. My mom had smudged her lipstick. "Elena," she said, "please." I continued to walk. My father caught up to me and said, "We saw Ruth's post. We had no idea how far you had come. We were unaware." I pivoted. "You mean you were unaware that I had survived? Or did you fail to see that I would accomplish it without you?" Both of them appeared hollow. My mother remarked, "We're not asking for much. We're just having trouble." I left that hanging. Then they repeated what they had said to me before. "I have faith in God's plan." I then turned to go, not upset, staying steady. Simply put, it is free. Justice doesn't always resemble a courtroom or a news story. It's just living well occasionally. Their stillness was never louder. A few months after the incident outside the conference hall, everything returned to silence. It was not the oppressive silence I was accustomed to. This instance was not like the others. This silence felt well-earned, calm, mine. I ceased monitoring my inbox for the arrival of the next guilt trip. I was free of the icy echo of invisibility. Those who had chosen not to look were no longer seeking me out. I put all of my energy into what Ruth and I had constructed instead. We grew the company by adding mentorship programs, workshops, and sliding scale choices for low-income families. Ruth handled every step with a level of happiness I had never witnessed in her. She seems to have made assisting others her second life. And me? At last, I stopped surviving. I began to live. I purchased a small apartment of my own, complete with windows that let in sunlight, a peaceful reading nook, and plants that flourished on a ledge facing the rising sun. My days were mine, even though they weren't very glitzy. Nobody else could influence them. And that was all. Occasionally, I would receive a communication from an old neighbor or cousin. "Your parents are currently renting." Caleb took a step back. They seldom ever hear from him. "Your mother works in retail. Your dad is attempting to work for himself." I paid attention. I gave a nod. I continued walking. Recovery does not necessitate a return. It involves learning to carry the weight without letting it bring you down. Then I got a letter in the mail one day, written by hand. The return address is not provided. The penmanship was familiar to me. I could guess what it would say without ever opening it. Nevertheless, I did. There are 2 pages inside. "Sorry, I'm sorry." The same cliché. "We simply had no idea how strong you were." When people need an excuse for their carelessness, they say that. But I didn't persevere because of my strength. Love did. Ruth's affection. Mine. And the one I gave myself once I quit pleading for theirs. Not out of resentment, but because I didn't have to reply, I folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer. There was nothing left for me to prove. I wasn't waiting in any way. Ruth and I organized a week-long retreat for first-generation students that summer, which was our largest workshop to date. In the mountains, we rented a peaceful cottage campus and stocked it with books, journals, hot meals, and long-suppressed fantasies. We also had a campfire on the final night. "Miss Elena, how did you know your story wasn't over?" I asked Zoe, a shy but intelligent student who sat next to me. I gave her a smile. I said, "It's never over." "Not until you make the final decision." She gazed up at the stars after giving a slow nod. In that instant, I recognized myself as the woman who rewrote her destiny, not the girl abandoned by her parents. I sat by myself on the cabin porch later that evening. It had burned low. The silence reigned. And as I gazed at the moonlit woods, I experienced a sensation I hadn't had in a long time. Light. Not because everything was flawless. However, because I at last grasped what no one had ever told me, it's not necessary to earn love. Family need not be biological, and you don't have to wait for independence. You walk in its direction. I shut my eyes, inhaled deeply. I started working on the next chapter. It was a gift that I couldn't give to anyone else. Have you ever experienced rejection, even from members of your family? Please feel free to share your story in the comments. Additionally, if this one resonated with you, please remember to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who should know you're not invisible. You are sufficient.